Welcome back for AP US History. It is good to see all of your virtual selves again. We have got another fun day of stuff to go over. Like I said yesterday, we're out of like the big famous things. Now we're into just the the themes, overarching themes. And so it won't necessarily be as fantastic and intriguing and alluring as, Civil War or World War II or whatever, but they're just as important, and there are questions on all of them on test day, so we want to make sure we go over it. Heather is here again in the chat, helping out and encouraging you. So be sure to say hello to her and ask her any questions you may have. So today we're going to cover migration, immigration, and mass movement. And so I know a lot of times we talk about immigration and a lot of people coming to America, from Europe and different points in time. But when we're talking about mass people movements in the United States, there's more than just immigration. There's more than just the 1900s European immigrations, and then different, Latin American immigration. These different ones like that. There are different ones, and some of the migrations and mass movements actually are just from one area to another. And so that is what we are going to be discussing today. So once again, just so that if you have not seen this yet, just a reminder about the new testing, what's going to happen if you are new, that they have cut 20% off of the test, not of the topics necessarily, but of the dates. So anything after World War II is pretty much not going to be covered. But all of the questions are not going to be multiple choice. They're all going to be free response. And so the ability to go through and demonstrate your content knowledge is going to be by linking things together. And so that's why we still do multiple choice questions while we're together, because it demonstrates your content knowledge. And it helps you to reinforce that, especially if there's some that is not quite as often covered. And so that's one of the things that we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the immigration and the rise of the boss and the nasty underbelly of things like that. But we also are going to talk about a great migration that took place, and also some people movements that were enacted, so that you will have the full story in case they ask you to bridge, which they might. So we're up to number 7, which is the migration, immigration, and mass movement. And then tomorrow is our final session, where we're going to talk about some social change issues. That's exciting. And so here we go. Right off the bat, man. So if you remember, you may not remember this, but there was a very large migration of African Americans after the Civil War. They moved north to larger towns, more industrial towns, in hoping for jobs and different things like that. So this is actually one of the areas that very well could be covered in one of the questions. And it's not one that's covered as often in a course. And so I wanted to make sure that we did look at it, so you have some background on it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a minute to read this particular excerpt. And then we have some questions on it that hopefully they're going to help you to reinforce some knowledge you had, or if you didn't have it, that you can gain it, so you are going to be even better prepared for test day. So right off the bat, 1 minute to read this excerpt. Okay, so that was a minute. I want to show you something that is, if you're not familiar with this time period, sorry, if you're not familiar with this time period, look at this. 5 million, 5 million people moved. That is enormous. That is an enormous amount of people. Um, I mean, just think about the size today in the city. I mean, cities that is would be one of the largest cities in the United States, basically relocating somewhere else. I mean, just imagine the difference that created in both the South, where these people were leaving, and in the big cities that they were going to. I mean, that is a colossal movement. And that's maybe not something that is covered as well. And so why would that many people be willing to completely relocate to an area that they are not even familiar with? So let's look at some questions. I know one of them popped up accidentally during it, but we're going to go ahead and do it anyway. And as usual, I'm only going to give you 30 seconds because hopefully on test day, when you're doing your questions, you may have an average of a minute. Sorry, I just fall back into my old habit about multiple choice questions. There aren't going to be any multiple choice questions on the test, so I don't need to go through all the strategies for that. Anyway, I'm giving you 30 seconds because hopefully you'll be able to derive the answer in that shorter amount of time. The reading takes a little longer. So here we go, 30 seconds for number one. All right, I am seeing a whole bunch of people saying D. A whole bunch of people are saying D, and D would be the right answer. Yes, industrial jobs with good pay. That's why they left. Now, that was the major motivation. Is there, could these other ones be part of the motivation? Sure. But the major reason was that there were jobs in industries paying well. That's the biggest reason that they moved. Okay. Let's look at number two. Number two, this is a great question, by the way. This is fantastic. This would be, I wish that this was like a short answer question. This is so good. All right, so 30 seconds. Let's go for it. All right, not as many answers on this one. It's not as obvious, especially since some of these things may be lesser covered things. So which one is most similar? Most similar, and it's going to be based in the fact that some of this was a false promise, a false hope, where the people heading north were hoping something else was going to happen and it didn't. So this is why it's actually going to be A, the Exodusters' migration to Kansas, because if you look at our note down at the bottom, people were attracted to Kansas because they thought that they were going to get free land and work animals, and they didn't. And people heading to the north thought that they were going to get good paying jobs and less discrimination, which they did not. They didn't get good paying jobs. They got jobs, but not all of them were good paying. And the discrimination, it was still there. And like somebody mentioned on the last question I saw in the chat, somebody said, wasn't there still racial violence in the North? Yes, there was. Like a lot of the communities, when this influx happened, all of a sudden they completely looked different, and there was some backlash. And so this was and both of these were based on a false promise that led to it. And so that's where they were the same. And I know some of you are like, what in the world? Yeah, I know it's a tougher question. But think how awesome it is that now you learned it. Now you saw it. You saw the Exodusters migration, and we talked about the Great Migration. What if they ask something like that, and now you have those extra things in your back pocket to throw in there as evidence? So like the California gold rush, there at least was some payoff for some people, is where that's gonna come into play. In general, both the Great Migration and the Exodusters was disappointing on a large scale to just about everybody. So that's where that's going to be more of a correct answer. But yeah, the California gold rush, there was some disappointment for sure, but not on the level or the scope of these other ones, where it was almost like advertised. The California gold rush, people were like, hey, you might find gold, and then they ran and did it. It wasn't like people were like, come to California and come find gold, as much as it was people just going there. These other ones, it was like almost like there was an active pull to them. All right, number 3, which of the following African-American institutions rose to prominence? Let me go ahead and give you again 30 seconds for this one. Okay, which of the following African-American institutions rose to prominence during the time of the Great Migration? So again, remember, when is this? When is this? It's talking about, it's going to happen early right near the beginning of the World War I, right? The beginning of World War I. So it's actually going to be B. Actually, it's going to be B. Where the Niagara movement started in 1905, and then it merged with other groups and became the NAACP in 1908, and then continued to grow. Freedmen's Bureau is going to be before that. It's going to be before. And so this is going to happen. The mass movement is really at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. Is when that is happening. So it would end up being answer choice B. And again, this is a very important group to be aware of, because it still has a lot of power, and is doing a lot now still. And so, all right. So that kind of covers some of the Great Migration, so that you are aware of what that is, and some information on it. And from what it seems like, that may have been a gap in our knowledge, and so that's great that you found that, so that you can kind of reinforce that. Hopefully, what we did will help you guys out with that as well. So this is now we're moving into immigration. So look at the difference here on this heading. We're talking 1820 to 1860. So this is the first wave of immigration. This would be pre-Civil War. So most of the time, most of the newcomers, most of the immigration groups that came in are going to be from Northern and Western Europe. So, you know, you're going to see some Scandinavian, you're going to see English, French, those kind of countries. Irish for sure. They're mostly in the Northeast, low wage jobs. Germans were mostly in the Midwest. And then there was backlash to this. There was a lot of backlash to this. Okay. And in answer, someone's asking if we're going to do any free response. Yeah, we're building up to that. So like what I'm doing is I'm laying down some content, and then we're going to build up to how we could address some free response questions regarding those topics. So there is definitely a backlash to this movement, this immigration. The Know Nothing Party was against immigration. And one of the big issues people had with Italians in particular, but also with Irish, was the strength of this Roman Catholicism that they brought. It has been a severe bias for a very long time. And it still exists in some areas even now. Where do these people have an allegiance? Is like, are they allegiant to the US, where they are now, or are they allegiant to the Roman Catholic Church? Do they answer to the Pope or to the president? And that was one of the big backlashes. It's one of the reasons that they were not voted into public office. Actually, if you go through, there's only been one Catholic president. Like if you go through there and look at all of them, Kennedy is the only Catholic president that there's ever been. Because that is something that people just would not allow. You kind of see some of this similar debate recently with Mitt Romney, with the Mormon Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS. That was some of the backlash against Romney himself, was the same kind of question. And so that's what happened. That was what the earlier immigration faced, was there was already a backlash there. Nativist, what's really ironic about that name, right? You know, nativist, like anybody in that movement was actually a native of the United States, because none of them were, but whatever, you know. So then the second wave of immigration, this happens after the Civil War, the 1880s through the 1920s. If you remember from a couple days ago, we were talking about the foreign policy and how all of a sudden the US had the largest economy in the world, the fourth largest population in the world. They are believing that there is opportunity here. The Horatio Alger myth that we talked about yesterday, that you could come here and make something of yourself. You could come here and survive, get away from the fighting, get away from the famines, get away from all of that stuff, and you can be here. These newcomers are going to be more Central, Southern, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Asia, not welcomed as much. There is now a more obvious difference between this group and the last group. So you had the Greeks, Italians, Jews, and Slavs tended to be in the Northeast, and the Asian, especially the Chinese immigrants, would be mostly in the West. They didn't have much power. There was a lot of ethnic-based slums and things like that. Now, the political machines did provide jobs for people, but it was at the promise of their vote. And so these machines rose up in the big cities and basically, were buying votes by providing things. Now they didn't, it wasn't like they were providing really nice stuff, but it was like when you had nothing and you had nowhere to go and nowhere to live and nowhere to work, anything was going to be helpful. And it's also, just think about how hard it would. So in the original one, that 1848, 1880, it's just something to think about. Again, could this be a question that they ask? Absolutely. the difference between the immigration movements of 1840 to 1880 and 1880 to 1920. The groups that came in the 1840 to 1880, even though there were some religious-based problems and things like that, those people still looked very similar. They had similar backgrounds to a lot of the people who were in America. They sounded similar, at least a good number of them did. And so it was a lot harder to point them out. When you're talking about the groups that are now up on screen, they're going to have different voices, different accents, different foods, different religions. They're a lot more obvious. And so the reaction could escalate. So Matthew mentioned something about the political cartoon with the political machines. There's a ton, and we use in our book, there are some of those in there where it's like they show you some picture and it's about the political machine. I didn't use some of those today because I wanted to focus more on the people movements part of this, but yeah, those are very common, and they are frequently short answer questions. So, all right, so here's a number 4. This doesn't have a passage with it, so I'm gonna go ahead and give you a minute to do it. Looking at this, figuring out about what that influx of immigrants meant. So go ahead and work on that and put your answer into the chat. Okie dokie. Yes, you guys nailed this one. Indeed, indeed. It is the growth of the urban political machines. That is what the influx of immigrants is going to lead to. Because like we just mentioned, they provided jobs or living places and connections and things like that. And so then they ended up voting for those people, and then those people rose to power through less than ideal means. So. All right. And someone mentioned C. Someone mentioned C, and I did want to mention that one. That one's a tricky answer because of one thing. And again, this isn't a multiple choice test anymore. But just to think about this concept, there wasn't diversity at that point. Diversity. I mean, not in the way that word should be meaning. It's like, were there a lot of different groups in the urban areas? Yes. Were they integrated? No, they were not. So you think that, so what you would actually have is you're going to have like groups of Polish people and groups of German people and groups of, Czechoslovakian people and groups of Italian. They're like in their own areas. And so it's not, ethnic diversity is not really the right word for it. And that's why it's not going to be C. So again, a concept to just kind of flesh out as you're thinking through that. All right, number 5, here we go. Another, I love questions that say stuff like this, even if they're multiple choice, because that could easily turn into a short answer question. Anytime they're asking you something about a parallel, because then we have to prove the parallel. So go ahead and look at number 5 and vote on it. Okay, so which of the following from the mid, so this would be that 1810 to 1840, most clearly parallels the ones from the 1880 to 1920? Which of those is going to be the same? You guys got it, A. So there was nativism towards German and Irish immigration, which if we go back to that whole, more obvious, Germans and Irish are going to be more obvious than like English immigrants. And so, because they're going to have a different accent, the Irish had a different religion, things like that. But yes, that is going to be the parallel that we see later on with the groups coming in that second wave. Excellent work, guys. Number 6. Go ahead and work on number 6 and vote in the chat. Okay, number 6. Which of the following groups would most likely oppose the perspective? I'm going to guess the group that would most likely oppose this perspective are the Native Americans in the first place. I think they would most dislike this because it is completely inappropriate. Did you get a little cringe when you saw this pop up? I do. I really do. It's like that's one of the problems with studying history, especially if you're studying American history. And I love teaching American history, but there are parts of it that make me ill. And so this is one of them. So who's going to be opposed to this? The idea, what this cartoon is showing is basically if those, what they're saying is if those people who came over on the Mayflower and everything like that had the same view of immigration as this lodge bill, then the Native Americans would have just killed them all and it wouldn't have mattered. But they were like, they're saying, aren't you glad that our ancestors murdered and stole land and all of that stuff? Because otherwise we wouldn't be here. Yeah, great. Thank you for that. So it's going to be D. It's going to be D. Trying to protect these immigrants is what they're trying to do, so that they wouldn't, keep getting attacked. So. All right. Moving on. So notable immigration laws. So here come some of these immigration laws that we're referring to. In 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese Exclusion Act restricted Chinese immigration into the US. Emergency Quota Act and the Immigration Act of 1921 set a strict limit on how many people could come from a given nation. So National Origins Act of 1924, this is limiting Southern and Eastern Europeans. Yeah, that I know. I'm thinking like as I'm reading that, I'm like, I'm also the question, that last question was a little bit odd. Because if it's saying real Americans, that's what I'm trying to get that as well. Because it doesn't seem like that matched right. I'm checking something. Just one moment. Oh, you just saw me checking that. Nice. So yeah, it does. I want to check on something on that last one, on that picture, if we had all the right information on it, because these immigrant acts that are coming through in the 1880s and 1920s, they're limiting people. They're limiting people from coming in. And so I'm wondering, like, if the real, what his definition of the real Americans was on the caption. And so we can come back to that and look at it, okay? But for right now, let's look at the acts that are coming along. And we'll figure out what was going on with that last question in a second here. So these laws are in place to flat out discriminate against these different groups. They're limiting the number of people coming in. They are saying that they're basically based on each nation, where they're from. It sounds a lot like some other immigration laws that were recently passed, where we're limiting from different countries. That's kind of what's going on in this series here. In Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson era Immigration Act of 1965 finally is letting some people from other countries into the U.S. that had been limited from before. So if you look at it in 1965, and they had been limited since 1924. So I mean, 40 years before it opened the doors to them to come in. And so, I mean, that was a pretty long-term issue. So the information I'm getting really does not help me to know on that question about that picture. So maybe we'll just ignore the question. Because the Lodge bill was another way to ensure that everybody would have the right to vote. Another rule, another law that was trying to get that to happen, even though the amendments that had been passed, 13th, 14th, 15th, already had said that they would be allowed to be citizens and to vote. They still were not being allowed to, and the Lodge bill was trying to fight that. So not sure exactly what the picture was trying to do with that. So let's just act like that didn't happen. It didn't happen. That picture didn't happen. This did, though. These are important. So I would know these. Moving back on, getting back on track. Here we go. There also is going to be the Great Society legislation of the Bilingual Education Act of 1968. There's a lot of stuff that Johnson does, a lot of bills that deal with civil rights, a lot of acts that deal with civil rights under Johnson's administration. That's when you see like the Civil Rights Bill get passed. In 65, the Immigration Act gets passed, the Bilingual Education Act gets passed. There's quite a few that he spearheads. That was one thing. He had, being in the legislature as long as he was, he really had a connection getting Congress to do things. He really understood that. I'm not like sitting there saying, you know, I'm not judging Johnson in any way, shape, or form, but just as far as civil rights things go, he managed to get things through that I don't know if any other president would have had the ability to. because he had his finger on the pulse of the Congress from being in it for so long. So yeah, so a lot of great stuff came through with him. Okay, so we've talked about the Great Migration. We've talked about the immigration movements. So now I want to talk about another mass movement when we may not think about this, but this is where the American Indians, the Native Americans, whatever term you're wanting to use, they were moved, forcibly moved. And so there are several times that this happens. This is one of them. And what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and read this. This is a law that comes through, and read it and see if you can process what it's talking about. We're going to have 3 questions, and then we're going to look at some ways to tie these 3 things together. Okay, so go ahead and take a minute to read the Dawes Act. Okay, so Dawes Act, the Dawes Act. Anybody familiar with what the Dawes Act does before we get into the questions? Does anyone remember what the Dawes Act was for? This is typical legalese, you know, when we start putting things into laws and it's like all tough to read. I wish it was just like, why can't you just use normal English, man? Just say what you're doing. Why do you have to like use all these with-ins and Heatherforths and allotments and everything? So the Dawes Act, not great. I think you can get to the point where most laws that involve American Indians, Native Americans are bad. I mean, like it kind of can hit that point where they're not going to end well. Nikki, yeah, that they basically are breaking up tribal land. You know, they're taking away those things. So here we go. Number 7. Go ahead and answer this question. So which of the following was a result, judging from your answers to the previous thing that I asked? It is definitely going to be answer choice D, the decrease in tribal autonomy. What the Dawes Act basically was doing was trying to force the American Indians to be assimilated into American culture. Is kind of it, like trying to destroy the tribal organizations, trying to destroy the way things had been done. So what they would do is they would like kind of push them into one area and then sell off the other areas. and be like, oh, well, you don't need all of that. You only need half of that. And then put them even more in touch with the other Americans coming in. So here is number 8, which is, again, a really good question right here. A really good question right here. Again, counter example. I love it because that means that you could be prepared for a short answer question on something like this. So start. All right. So a counter example of this. So this original and what they're wanting to do is they're trying to force Indians and whites to interact. Okay. So think about what would be the opposite of that. And it's going to actually be C, the Jim Crow laws, which were trying to force blacks and whites apart. So Jim Crow laws were passed to keep them apart, but the Dawes Act was passed to force them to interact, so that eventually the American Indians would lose their way of life and become just like everyone else, in theory. So that's why 8 would be C, is that they had opposite goals. Opposite goals. All right, we're going to skip this one and get right to, all right. So in tying in to all of this, this is a good opportunity to look at a free response question, okay? So what we've got is a big chunk. We did one of these the other day where you read one person's opinion, read the other person's opinion, and you immediately know that the first question is going to be, what is one difference between? And so that's going to be what we're talking about here. And so I'm going to give you guys 2 minutes to read this. I want 2 minutes to read, and then we're going to look at each of the separate questions that they're going to ask to see how we can attack each one of them. So I'll give you 2 minutes to read this, and then we will resume with our discussion. Okay, so we've read these two different positions. We're going to have to figure out what the difference is, all right? So these are going to be the questions, and again, we don't know what this is going to look like on test day. We don't know exactly what the questions are going to be like, but we can at least recognize the fact that the way to prove that you know content is to make you demonstrate it by connecting things together. And so asking like the difference in how these people were presenting their stuff, that still is a valid question. Asking for one event that shows that is also a valid question. And so you want, but no matter what, you have to answer what they ask and you have to use their guidelines, including dates. Like these say 1780 to 1840. You can't pick stuff from outside that window, even if you have something that works. And so make sure that when you're picking your examples that you are following all of the instructions in order to get a point. So here is a question for us to look at. Go ahead, I'm going to give you like a minute to read it and put your answer in. I want to see, what did you notice? What is one difference between Dowd and Purdue, between those two perspectives? What is something that they are talking about that is different? Hopefully you guys were able to pick up on that. So 1 minute to work on that. Okay, tell me what you noticed that was different between Dowd and Purdue. And it's a little bit tougher. It's a little bit tougher on this one than on some of them. If you know, if we're here the other day when we had Wells and that other person, it was tough to kind of see what they were saying as well. But in this one, hopefully you were able to see it. This one is talking about broke. This is where the clue comes from. Broke with their accommodating countrymen. They're talking about how they should resist. I see Lisa put that in there. Yes, Dowd is talking about that the most vital thing was when they got together and resisted being assimilated, resisted the expansion of the United States. Purdue is talking about the Cherokees, where she's saying that their vital thing, what they did that was notable, was that they were willing to be assimilated. Like they kind of went along with those things and started to change who they were to accommodate civilization. Right there, you can see that. And you guys are doing a really good job with that, yes. And so, like, this is something like a sample response that you could have for something like that, talking about how there was the difference between the fighting of the movement and the accommodating of the movement. Good job. All right. So let's look at the second part of it, where it talks about one event from 1780 to 1840 that is not mentioned. So it has to be from this period, and it has to be not mentioned to support Dowd. So think of an example of where a group fought off the advancement. Okay, so in this case, we're looking for one historical event that supports Dowd's interpretation about, um, fighting off the advancement, resisting. There's going to be multiples that you could use, but you have to remember that 1840 time limit. So if you pull something, like with Custer and stuff like that, it's not going to work because that's too far out. But you could use something like the Battle of Tippecanoe. You could use the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And so things like that are going to be opportunity. Those are going to be some examples that you could use. So a couple of you are mentioning Cherokee versus Georgia. It's actually interesting. Cherokee versus Georgia is one they use in the next question where they ask something supporting Purdue's position, because they're actually using the infrastructure of the government to fight. They're actually fighting within the court system, not on the battlefield. And so this would be an opportunity where there's probably going to be more of a physical confrontation in Dowd's book. So for C, and we're right up against time, but I'm going to show you like what we were talking about. Like we just were mentioning, Cherokee versus Georgia, Treaty of Greenville, Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. I'd love to go to Dancing Rabbit Creek. That's just a cool sounding name. But Cherokee versus Georgia was going to be the biggest one, where they are using the court system. They are working within the system. They're not fighting the system. That's the big thing about that one, and why that would work with what Purdue is saying, where they became a part of things. Louisiana Purchase, I don't know if that would work as far as that goes or not. Probably, I'm gonna guess no. I'm gonna guess no. It's got to be something where we're looking at the American Indians like coming alongside and cooperating with the government instead of fighting and resisting. So, okay, so that migration, immigration, and mass movement lesson. Tomorrow, our final one, we're going to be looking at some social changes that take place and how it's a great hotbed for questions, because we're going to track how different groups are treated from the beginning to the end. And that's always going to be a good place for them to look for questions that you're going to have to write answers for. So that's what we're going to cover tomorrow. At the top of the hour, Ari and Nick are going to come back for yet another thrilling installment of AP Biology. And I'm sure that you'll love that. I'm glad I'm not there because I can't stand biology, but teach his own. So have an awesome day. Hope to see you tomorrow.